Can you hear me with this? Is that okay? Okay, great. Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you Vauhini for, it's such a privilege for me to be able to speak to you because I really loved your novel. When I was reading it, I resented having to put it down to do anything else because it was such an enjoyable story. I was really captivated by the characters and the story and the setting and everything else. So congratulations, first of all, on this great achievement. And it was very recently nominated for the Pulitzer Prize as well. So congratulations, first of all. For those in the audience who haven't read the book, could you summarize it in a few sentences, if that's okay?
Yes. Thank you. It's an honor to be talking with you too, Deepa. I loved your book as well. Okay, so The Immortal King Rao is the story of a boy who is born on a coconut grove in the south of India in Andhra Pradesh. And this is the 1950s. He's born into a Dalit family. And his family is sort of upwardly mobile. They have come to own this land on which they're growing coconuts and selling them. And eventually, he's a very precocious child, and he eventually goes to school, studies engineering, and moves to the U.S. in the 1970s to embark on a career in technology. So he starts a technology company, and this technology company is very successful. It's called Coconut, and it grows and grows, and eventually becomes not only the biggest company in the world, but sort of spinning forward into this kind of near future, becomes so powerful that it takes over all world governments, and King Rao sort of engineers a sort of societal shift in how societies are organized and run. And this novel is actually narrated by his daughter, whose name is Athena, in the aftermath of all of this, and she's telling the story of her father's life.
That's great. Do you think you could read maybe from the beginning of the novel
Absolutely.
to give the audience a taste of your writing style and your voice?
King Rao left this world as the most influential person ever to have lived. He entered it possessing not even a name. In the beginning, his mother-to-be stood at the little general store in the center of her village, eyeing the tins of soap piled neatly on the countertop facing the road. It was 1951. Radha had seen this brand before on excursions to Rajamundry with her father and sister. But finding a stack of soap tins at their shop, 3 high and 2 wide, pairs, 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 was something else altogether. Radha was 18, and she hated Kottapalli, this hot, wet nothing of a village, nestled in the elbow crook of one of the many canals delivering the Godavari River east to the Bay of Bengal. Its name meant simply new village, the equivalent in Telugu of all of the new towns scattered around the English-speaking world. Several variations on the name could be found in the region. This particular village was distinguished, if that word could even be used, by the arrangement of its small center around a circle where the roads converged. In the middle of the circle stood a peepal tree, under which men congregated in the shade, sitting on overturned wooden crates borrowed from the general store, while stray mutts made languid tours around them, hoping for food scraps. Around the circle were the government school, the offices of the tax collector, and the village council president, the vegetable and fruit vendors with their carts, a shop selling farm tools, and the general store before which Radha stood.
Great, thank you. That's such a, I want to return to the subject of the voice of the novel later on, but first I want to say that, what I particularly admired about the novel is that it's so panoramic in scope, and it combines these multiple genres. It's a historical novel, it's a family saga, it's also a dystopian novel, maybe speculative as well. When I was reading it, I was thinking, this is as if somebody has taken a suitable boy and given it the Black Mirror treatment.
That's amazing, thank you.
I was wondering, were you aware that was what you were doing as you started writing, that you were sort of crossing genres, or did it just happen very organically?
It happened really organically, and it's funny because some people have noticed that around the time that this book was published, there were all these other books that came out, like Jennifer Egan's The Candy House, this book by the writer Sequoia Nagamatsu called, I'm blanking on the name, but there are a number of books around the same time that blend like historical writing and speculative writing. And I think there must just be sort of something in the air, because for me it was very organic. Like I said, the book started on a trip with my dad. I was in graduate school and I was working on short stories, and my dad said to me, "Why do you keep working on short stories? Nobody reads those. You should write a novel instead." And I was like, "Okay, Dad, give me an idea for a novel." And he gave me a couple of bad ideas, and then he gave me this one good idea, which was to write about the family Coconut Grove where he grew up. Also at a time of a lot of change in India, where to be Dalit did involve there was some social mobility that became available to Dalit families. And his family, my family, was part of that change. And so he said, "Why don't you write about that?" And I was like, "Well, that is a good story. Okay, I'll try." And then the problem was that, I did not grow up in India at all. I grew up in Canada and in the US. I am Dalit, but I didn't grow up sort of experiencing directly the kind of oppression that my dad and my family members of his generation faced growing up in South India. I've never lived on on the family coconut grove that still exists. And so I felt I didn't know how I could go about writing a book like this that was meant to be sort of directly from the perspective of a character like that. Like if I tried to write it in the first person, for example, as if I were King Rao, I don't think I would be able to pull it off. And so at the time I was watching the remake of Battlestar Galactica that came out in the 2000s.
Yeah.
Such a good show. Yeah. In which there's this technology that allows people to read, that allows some characters to read other characters' minds. And I was like, oh, if I could just have somebody access a technology like that to access the kind of world of King Rao but not be pretending to be him, that would be ideal. And that's where this mechanism of this other character who had access to all of his experiences and could recount them but wasn't pretending to be him or trying to be him came from. So it actually came out of this writing problem I had. And at first, I didn't know who that other voice was. And only later did I realize, like many years into the draft, did I realize it was his daughter, Athena.
Okay. Do you think your background is a tech journalist? Do you think that's part of the reason why you felt comfortable sort of using, a tech solution, I would say, to this writing problem? In general, I wondered how your background as a journalist and particularly writing about tech, how did that shape the story that you're telling about King Rao's story? Yeah. A two-part question.
No, that's a good question. I graduated from college in 2004, and I went to Stanford in the Bay Area, and I mentioned that because I was in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley. That was the year Facebook was founded. It was around the time, it might have been the year Google went public. It was around the time that YouTube was founded. And there was a guy who worked on this college newspaper with me who became one of the first employees at Facebook, stuff like that. It was very much in the zeitgeist for me as a college student. And then I graduated and I started working immediately at the Wall Street Journal as a tech reporter. And I was there for a few years, 4 years. And then I took this 2-year leave of absence to study creative writing. And when I took that 2-year leave of absence, I wasn't thinking now I shall go and write a novel about the tech world at all. And these stories I was writing didn't really have anything to do with that world that I had been writing about. But somehow I think it was just still in my mind, because somehow when I imagine this character who grew up like my dad my dad starting in the 40s, this character in the 50s in a small village in Andhra Pradesh, I imagined him somehow moving to the US in the 70s and starting a tech company. And it must not have been a coincidence, because the first tech company that I started writing about, my first beat, was Oracle, started by Larry Ellison in the 1970s. And I had been reading these historical books about Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison and Bill Gates in the 70s. So obviously that was in my mind somewhere. Yeah. And so those were the first two elements. I knew there was this kid on a coconut grove. I knew he would grow up and move to the US in the 70s and start a tech company. And so then I think when I realized what the solution was for my writing problem, it did come out of the fact that I knew that my protagonist was going to be a tech guy.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. A related question to that is that, the novel is also about the ways in which colonialism and capitalism are packaged. It's sold to us as progress. And, we are told that we now have the world at our fingertips. But I thought that the characters in your novel felt, they seem to be incredibly isolated and lonely in a way. And I was wondering if, those experiences of speaking to people who are starting these tech companies and reporting on tech, did that play a role? Were you writing about what you were witnessing, specifically in terms of the kind of isolation experienced by your characters? Because there seems to be a lack of understanding and communication in many ways. Yeah. I don't know if you agree with me.
No, I agree. I do agree. Yes, I mean, one thing that made its way into the book that very much came from my experience writing about tech companies is that sometimes, I mean, this is just my opinion, but sometimes I think when we hear tech CEOs say things like, especially those of us like in the humanities, like I think many people in the audience are, when we hear tech CEOs say things like, we're here to change the world, we're here to make a positive impact, our impression sometimes is that they're lying, right? Like they're trying to pull one over us. And it seemed to me in my experience writing about these companies that these tech CEOs, like they don't think they're lying. I think they fully believe in those visions. I mean, I don't know if any of you read the recent New York Times profile of Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of Theranos, who still, all these years later, she's now in prison and was interviewed by the New York Times just before she went into prison, and she still was insisting that, like, she really wanted to make a positive impact on the world, and when she gets out of prison, she thinks she's going to start a healthcare company, a healthcare technology company again, right? I think she truly, fully believed and believes in this vision of hers, and I think that's only an exaggerated version of what is true across Silicon Valley. Like, I think these people building technologies really feel that they're trying to make a positive difference in the world. And then I think there's an extent to which that's true. I think right now in 2023, we're very aware of the ways in which that's not true. But it's also true that, for example, when my parents moved to Canada in the 1970s, and when I was growing up in the 1980s, their families didn't have phones in their houses. And so if they wanted to communicate, they had to send a letter. And or on relatively rare occasions, they could call somebody else in the village who would then call my grandparents over and say, there's a phone call for you. And so I grew up like not really knowing my grandparents at all. My parents, once they moved to Canada and the US, were fairly isolated from their families. And now, I'm texting with my nieces and nephews and cousins on WhatsApp all the time, or having video calls with them. And so there are ways in which I think these technologies have made a positive impact. And yet it's undeniable that that they've fractured us also, and that this promise to like bring people together that a lot of technology companies are selling are sort of like based on these circumstances preceding that, in which big tech and big corporations have fractured societies. And so to say, oh yeah, and we big tech or big corporations have the solution to your problem strikes one as somewhat false.
Yeah. I did want to stay on the subject of technology, because you wrote this really beautiful, very moving essay called Ghosts, in which you write along with ChatGPT-3 about a subject that you couldn't write yourself, which was about the death of your sister. And you wrote it along with AI with surprising results. For anyone in the audience interested in this particular essay, it's available online on the Believer magazine. It's called Ghosts, and I highly recommend that apart from buying the book and reading it, read the essay as well, because it's such an incredible achievement. I think when I think about AI, and there's been such a lot of discussion about AI recently, and specifically with the writers' strike as well. everyone is worried about what AI will do to writing jobs and how companies are going to be using that. And I find that many writers are either fearful or disdainful. But with you, Amanda, you seem to be very curious about AI. And I worry about putting my words into, say, GPT-3 because it's going to reuse it elsewhere. It's contributing to its database. And how do you see that? And are you interested in exploring it and seeing it as, I saw somewhere that you called it a tool. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's really complicated. So in this essay, for those of you who haven't read it, I wrote about the death of my sister from cancer 20 years ago when we were both very young. And it's a subject that I had written about in fiction. I had sort of fictionalized, but I had never written about non-fictionally and had no idea how to write about. It's something that even all these years later is hard to even talk about. And so when I got access to GPT-3, which is a sort of predecessor to ChatGPT, it was before ChatGPT was out. It was before it was really in the zeitgeist and people were talking about it. I had written a profile of one of the founders of OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT and had made ChatGPT-3. I had written a profile of him for a magazine. And so when I read about GPT-3, this predecessor, I texted him and said, hey, can I have access to this? I'm curious about how it works. I'd like to play around. And then not with the intention of writing an essay, but just out of curiosity, I thought, what would happen if I tried to use this to write about this subject that's very difficult for me? I will say that a couple of years earlier, I had written an essay made up entirely of my Google search results over a decade. Sorry, not my results, my Google searches over a decade, which Google saves. And with that essay, the goal was in part to sort of create a narrative out of these searches of mine, but then also to kind of, in a meta way, also to kind of interrogate the ways in which we put this very personal information inside these big tech vehicles from which they profit without thinking much about it. And so you can read the essay and think, oh, this is a moving essay made up of somebody's Google searches, but you can also read it and think, wow, like Google knows all of this about this writer over the past decade. And with the essay Ghosts about my sister, I did intend, I think, for there to be that kind of meta layer of critique embedded in the essay, because similarly, these tools that and I do think of them as tools, but these tools are meant to help us articulate something that we aren't able to articulate. And in my case, the death of my sister was something very big that I could use to think about this idea. So on the one hand, by allowing me to, by helping me to write something about my sister, this company, this big tech company, OpenAI, founded by this guy, Sam Altman, who I had profiled, but also co-founded by Elon Musk, one of the richest and most powerful people in the world, they were giving me something, and they were also using my desire to extract something from me, really similarly from Google. And I think with Google, we don't think about it too much. We've been using it for all these years, but Google is profiting from these very personal questions of ours, right? And similarly, OpenAI is profiting from my desire to say something and my sense that I'm unable to say it on my own, right? And so for me, I think I'm most interested in these kinds of technologies when what I'm able to write about the technologies contains a kind of awareness of the way in which the technologies are operating on me, in addition to the way in which I'm operating the technologies, if that makes sense. I do find technology fascinating, and I think, like, as a thought exercise, I find it interesting to think about, like, what would it mean for a technology like ChatGPT, for example, to exist sort of divorced from the big tech apparatus that creates it? Like, can you imagine an anarchist? Could one imagine an anarchist ChatGPT in which, in order to build the technology, people opted in to provide their own language through this technology? It was provided for free to everybody. Nobody owned the product, right? one can imagine that, but it's really expensive to build these things. And so you end up in this loop where it's like, okay, well, who would fund a effort like this? Oh, probably you need to get Elon Musk or someone like that to fund it.
Yeah. And how did that shape, how you created Athena's voice? Because you're talking about how, you want a critique to be embedded in your writing as well. And definitely that's what the book does. There is also a critique of the technology that King Rao has created. And that's what the book is about. And so knowing all this, how did that shape her voice? I'm wondering, because she is like it's like a narrator in a 19th century novel. She's like an omniscient narrator, and she has access to all this information as long as she can connect to the internet. And so how did it really, how do you create a voice like that which can actually know everything, but is also just a 17-year-old in other ways?
Yeah, no, that was really hard. And so I can't remember if I said this explicitly earlier, but the mechanism by which Athena, the narrator, is able to read her father's mind, essentially, is that she can connect to the internet with her mind, which also means she can, read Wikipedia with her mind and that sort of thing. And so the way I thought about her voice, I really struggled with it. I think it's one of the reasons this took me so long to write. I really struggled with it. I had a lot of early readers who would read early drafts of the book and say, she needs to sound more intelligent. Like, she needs to sound like somebody very wise. If she knows everything, she has to be like a kind of godlike figure in the way she talks, but she's not in the book. And so I was kind of banging my head against the wall for a while thinking, like, well, I'm not godlike and omniscient, and so how can I create a voice that's like that? Not dissimilar to the fact that I'm not a 5-year-old boy in the 1950s on a coconut grove, and so how can I, it was like just a problem of writing in some ways. And so I decided to think of it as being not too dissimilar to how we actually live in the world now, where if I have a question about anything in particular, I can pick up my phone and look it up and absorb that very superficial knowledge into how I view the world. And that's true for her as well. It's not that all of the world's knowledge exists within her brain. It's just that she can access it through her mind rather than having to pick up her phone and type it, And so I think that allowed me, that kind of narrator is not too difficult to imagine, because it's so close to where we are now. And so in the voice of the book, she's often sort of telling us these asides about facts that she knows. Yeah. But they're somewhat superficial facts. They're facts that any of us could find out by reading on Wikipedia, for example.
Yeah. When did you know that, when did you get the right voice? Was it after several years or?
It was a long time.
Okay.
Yeah. Writers, I don't know how it was for your book, Deepa. I would like to know. I will say a lot of writers start with that voice, but for me it took me a long time to get to it. But what about you?
Yeah, it took me a long time.
Did it? Okay. Yeah.
I want to talk about the book as well and its structure, because you have these multiple timelines, as you said, when you're talking about the book. It has King Rao's childhood in the coconut grove, which is in the 50s and 60s, and then in the 70s we see him moving to the States, and where he sets up this company with the woman who becomes his wife, Margaret, and that's where everything else begins. And then you have a present day in the novel, which is almost like a near future. And I really admired how you moved between these timelines, and to me it seemed seamless. And so, part of me as a writer, I want to ask you, what's the secret? Like, how did you do it? And I was wondering, was there an image in Athena's narrative that made you, think about exploring what happened in King Rao's past, or did you write the timeline separately and then splice them together? Yeah, I just wondered how you done that.
Yeah, no, it was really hard. I struggled with that for a long time. And so, like I said, I started with King Rao's childhood. And so the first several drafts of the book were really just the story of him on this coconut grove in India, starting the company in some near future falling apart, and it was narrated by this voice, but I had no idea who the voice was. And then after some time, I realized that this voice was King's daughter. And so once I realized that, I made it clear on the page that it was King's daughter, and then I had friends read the book, and over, this was like 7, 8, 9 years into the writing, over and over they would say to me, okay, well, but if this person, Athena, is narrating the book and it's King's daughter, what's going on with her? What's her story? And I hadn't written any of that. And it's interesting because now that the book's out, that's the story people talk about the most and think about as sort of the sort of front story.
Yeah.
But it came at the very end. It came last. After I realized that if I'm going to have this narrator of King's story, she needs to have her own story too. In terms of the structure, I had no idea how to structure it. It was a mess for many drafts. But I think eventually the way I thought about the arc was that there's a kind of idea arc in the book about capitalism, about colonialism, about the way in which colonialism and capitalism and the two, like, as anyone who's read William Dalrymple's books are very aware of, the two are so intertwined, right? Capitalism and colonialism. So it's a way in which, like, that fractures social bonds, like family bonds, friendship bonds, community bonds. Like, that idea of, like, that progress came to me as a kind of arc that could sustain the book from beginning to end. And so then I was thinking about how within each of those storylines you could show that taking place. And so you sort of see that happening over each of the storylines at sort of the same rate or pace, so that it kind of made sense, like, hopefully, like, for readers, like, it feels like there's some logic to how you're moving.
Yeah. And I mean, you managed to maintain narrative suspense as well with these different timelines, which I think is really difficult to do. So that was something that I really admired. Was there a particular timeline that was challenging for you to write, or something that you were more interested in than the other two? Or,
yeah. It's funny because this book, like I said, started with this. Thank you. Started with this idea about King and his childhood on the coconut grove and starting the tech company. And those were things that I didn't have personal experience with, and so it made me feel a little intimidated to try to write about them. But I did a ton of research. I went back to my family, Coconut Grove, and interviewed a lot of family members and talked to people who had worked in the tech industry, who came from a South Asian background, and South Indian background in particular, in the 70s. So I did a lot of research. And in the end, it turned out that, like, especially the part set in India on the Coconut Grove, which I have no direct personal experience with except on visits to see my family, came easiest to me. And the part that was really hard was the speculative part set in a kind of somewhat dystopian near future, in part because I come from a standard literary fiction background, and in, like, the mid 2000s, when I was studying creative writing, the early to mid 2000s, it wasn't yet considered. It wasn't, like, yet an acceptable part of the literary creative tradition to be combining speculative and literary elements the way it now very much is. Yeah. And so I had no education in the speculative tradition or the sci-fi or dystopian traditions. And I hadn't read a lot. I hadn't read very widely in those traditions. And so I just didn't know how to write them. I did reading as I was working on the book to try to learn, but I was least experienced in writing in that way. And so that part was most difficult for me.
It does work really well, and I will go back to that, and we can talk a little bit more about the speculative timeline in the novel. But just picking up on something you said about the research, what was it like for you? Were there any particular challenges? Because I find that researching in India is quite difficult because you have to rely quite often on, say, people's memories and testimonials and oral histories, and that can change. And archives have been written by the colonizer. So what was that like for you, and were there any challenges in terms of translation or language?
Yeah, it was really challenging. So I started by reading. I read like some oral histories and other accounts, especially of sort of Dalit rural life in India. But as you know, and as many people in the audience know, that's a very varied and diverse experience, right? India is not a monolithic place. There's so much variety in what it might mean to be a Dalit rural person in the 1950s from one place to another. Where my family is from, there was a lot of, I don't want to overstate it, but there was like a kind of flourishing of Dalit social and economic and political life in that period. And so if I were to read an oral history based elsewhere, I might understand the experience to be very different from what it was for my, for a family like mine. And so I did do a lot of that reading to situate myself. I talked to a lot of scholars of sort of 20th century Dalit history, Indian history. But then the other thing I did was I went back to my family Coconut Grove and to interview people. And the funny thing about that was that before I went back, I said to my dad, hey, Dad, can you help me think of somebody local in the village who doesn't have ties to our family or anything like that, who could, because I don't speak my family's language. I don't speak Telugu. I can kind of understand it in a very basic way, but I don't speak it. So I was like, can you help me find a translator who can sort of go and do these interviews with family members with me? And he was like, yeah, I'm on it. And then the next thing I knew, my cousin who had little kids at home and my uncle who, was retired and had better things to do himself were like, we'll take you. It was supposed to be a 1-month research trip. And they were like, we're just going to take you and be your translators. So it ended up being like a much shorter than 1-month trip. And as you will not be surprised to hear, the research was very much influenced by the fact that my translators were my own cousin and my own uncle who had their own perspective on which factions of the family I should talk to and which I should avoid. And, somebody might spend 20 minutes describing something to me and my cousin would say, oh, that's not important. We can skip that part, somebody.
Was it frustrating for you to
yes, but the instinct, of course, is to say my cousin is a terrible translator, but of course it's not her problem. It's the deficiency is my own, So the frustration really, if I were to plummet to its depths, is a frustration with myself for not having the language background, the cultural knowledge to be able to properly do the research myself. And I think that limitation is an interesting limitation, hopefully a writer like me recognizes that limitation and does something with it, Another interesting experience, for example, is that I was interviewing my eldest aunt on my dad's side, who, being the eldest aunt, being the sort of oldest girl in the family of 6 kids, it wasn't an easy life for her, She had to do a lot, and her education wasn't necessarily prioritized when her younger brother's education was. And so she had a tough childhood. She's had a somewhat tough adulthood. And so I was interviewing her, and I said to her, what was your favorite food growing up? Which to me felt like a very neutral question. Everybody has a favorite food. And she kind of didn't seem to understand the question and also looked at me a little sternly. And then I thought maybe there was a language barrier. So I tried to explain again. And she again sort of looked at me blankly and also a little sternly, or as if she were annoyed. And then it turned out, through more conversation, that what she was suggesting to me or trying to make clear to me is that when she was a child growing up, she didn't have a notion of a favorite food because she was eating whatever was put in front of her. Nobody ever said to her, shall I make your favorite food for dinner tonight? And so this concept of a favorite food was foreign to her. In a way, and the fact of that was much more interesting to me than what her favorite food would have been had she had a favorite food. And I don't know if you remember, Deepa, from the book, but there is an exchange in the book where King, whose family is sort of being raised in this family at a time of upward mobility for the family, is asking an older aunt exactly that question, and she responds similarly. So things made their way into the book in ways like that.
It's also linked to what you're saying about your concerns about, not having had that experience. I was wondering if you, having written the book, do you feel differently about that? Do you think we need to have that experience to write about something? And how do you negotiate that, especially if you're a writer writing about India living abroad? I think this is a question, a challenge, almost an accusation that's put to you constantly, that you don't know what you're writing about. And how dare you write about this? That's not your experience. And so how do you find yourself negotiating that?
So first of all, I think it's a really useful and valid critique of diasporic Indian writers, South Asian writers, writers from anywhere probably, in the diaspora, living in the U.S., who may not have a lot of experience of these places they're writing about and have the privilege of publishing in the U.S. because they're American. And so, yeah, a lot of, in the U.S. market, which is the one I'm more familiar with, so I can speak to that one, though I assume it may be the case in the U.K. as well, a lot of what's published that is meant to give people an impression of life in India or Egypt or Colombia is not writers from those countries who are maybe writing in a native non-English language being translated, but rather diasporic writers who may be second generation, who maybe never set foot in the country that they're writing about, and somehow in the US imagination, those experiences that they're enacting on the page become considered the kind of authoritative idea of what that's like. And I think it's a problem that my book is one of very few, certainly is the highest profile, I'll say, book of fiction written by a writer from a Dalit background about rural life in India in recent years. There have been others more historically, but in the past, I would say several decades, when there are writers from those backgrounds living in India, sometimes writing in non-English native languages, who aren't able to get published in the US. And so they're much more deeply, they're much more knowledgeable perspectives on what life is really like in these places are not being seen. Obviously, I'm not arguing against the existence of my book. I'm arguing for a more sort of pluralistic idea of what literature is, right? That would allow space for my book as well as many other books from those perspectives. I think this may come partly from being a journalist. My background as a journalist, and I'd be interested in your thoughts and your experience of this also, because I know it's something that you've thought about in your own writing. But for me, it feels like when people come to fiction, they're not expecting the whole, the contract you have as a writer with the reader isn't that everything is made up, right? It's not that like, there are certain expectations of a representation of actual reality. For example, there's a short section of the book where I'm talking about the 1970s of Indira Gandhi and the emergency. And I think any reader who's reading this is going to assume that what I say about that, the kind of historical context, is factual. And it wouldn't be okay for me to say that the emergency took place in 1942, for example, right? Or to give Indira Gandhi a different name, for example. And so people do come to fiction with an expectation that they're going to learn something about the real world we're living in. And so even though technically I, as a fiction writer, don't need to get my book fact-checked, I'm not going to get sued if something is factually incorrect, I think there is a kind of assumption on the part of the reader. So I think we have a responsibility. Yeah, I have a lot to say on this topic. I would love to briefly hear, I know you're hesitant, but I'd love to briefly hear your thoughts on this.
No, I think it also connects to, how many books by writers of color are published in the West. Sadie Smith writes in, Right to Presume, or in Defense of Fiction. That was an essay that she wrote in the New York Review of Books. And she says that nobody worries about Updike's portrayal of the white man because there are so many portrayals. And I think we worry so much because we know this is going to be like, the one or two books by an Indian writer, in your case, by a Dalit writer that's coming out. So you feel a bigger sense of responsibility, I think. Just a quick note to the audience that we're coming to the end of a conversation and I'll be opening to the audience for questions. So do think of, anything that you want to ask. Before we wrap up, I want to talk to you about the portrayal of women in the book, because it is about King Rao, but he's surrounded by these very strong female figures. The story is narrated by his daughter, Athena, and his wife, Margaret, is essentially the brain behind, the marketing and the company Coconut.
Yeah.
And there is this, a rebel, Elman X as well, who has a major role to play within the story. And but Rao himself is from this, marginalized background, and so he does have the benefit of gender in a very patriarchal society. But at the same time, he's from a marginalized group as well. And so I was wondering about, we talk quite a lot about the absence of women in tech, absence of women coders. So you're talking about, you have to write about how women are being sidelined and how they try to exert their agency. At the same time, you have a hero and who's also a kind of antagonist in some sense, who is from a very marginalized background. And I wondered how you balance that, these very complicated questions of, everybody belonging to a marginalized group in a sense, and kind of have to write about that very unique power dynamic between them and their relationships.
Yeah. There are characters. It's a hard and really interesting question. There are characters in the book who come from marginalized backgrounds and choose to address that by challenging the power structure that marginalizes them. So, for example, in King's family growing up, he has a cousin who becomes very politically active and questions all kinds of power structures, including the power structures within his own family. And then there's King, who comes from this marginalized background, and his way to sort of integrate himself into society in a way that he feels is going to serve him is to figure out how to create a power dynamic on which he can sit on top, right? And so he's not interested in overthrowing any power dynamics. Similarly, King's wife, with whom he co-founds his company, is when they meet in the 70s, is this ambitious young woman who, because she's a woman, essentially does not have the ability to start her own tech company and be taken seriously. And when I say she doesn't have the ability, of course she has the innate ability, but within that social societal setting, she doesn't have the ability to do it. And so she very savvily aligns herself with King and says, okay, you be the CEO, I'm going to start this company with you, so that she can take advantage of the power he has as a man, right, to start a tech company. Another woman in the book is this character Element X, who's a sort of anarchist character who belongs to this kind of anarchist society, this order that springs out of the kind of late capitalist tech corporate world order that King runs. And so there's this character named Element X, who also, being a woman and for other reasons, suffers and is oppressed, and she responds to it. Unlike King's wife, Margie, she responds to it by, again, trying to question and take apart the societal structures that oppress her and other people. And so all of which is to say that, like, I didn't want to have these sort of schematic characters that just represent different ways of viewing the world, but I was curious about those different ways of viewing the world and, like, what would happen to a character with these different characters with these different persuasions when they sort of come up against the pressures of the real world. And I wanted to show that there are sort of like merits and also disadvantages to both approaches. I don't think I meant for there to be kind of pure heroes or anti-heroes in the book. And so, I find those questions really interesting too.
Yeah, I do agree. Every character is quite complex, and we can't really say, there is a hero here or a villain here. And even the figure of Rao is drawn with so much empathy, despite, everything that he has done. You do feel for him in many ways as well. I could talk about this book for hours, but I'm just going to give the audience a chance to ask a question. If you can raise your hand, perhaps we can get a mic along to you. Yeah.
Hi, great listening to you. Really, really sort of intriguing and interesting what you've been saying about your writings. You mentioned earlier a very nice point about tech entrepreneurs, in a sense, wanting to change the world for the better. And I wonder whether, and I totally agree with that, I wonder whether that question can be put to you. Do you see your writings as, in some sense, bringing positivity to readers, or is it pure entertainment value that you're kind of targeting?
Yeah, no, I love that question. For me, sometimes I've been asked in interviews, like what my goal is, what my goal was with this book, for example, or what I wanted readers to take from it. And I think for me, subjectively, the value of any kind of art is like, it's intrinsic in the work itself. For me, like I don't, I'm less interested in sort of like what the secondary outcomes of a book's existence might be. So for example, if somebody reads my book as a critique of capitalism and, say Jeff Bezos reads my book as a critique of capitalism and thinks to himself, I didn't think about these things before. I think I'll dismantle my company and redistribute all my wealth to the poor, right? That would certainly maybe be a positive outcome, according to some people, but it's not one of my goals. I think there's value like in art, period, whether it's critiquing anything in particular, whether it just exists. Like I think there's a kind of unique sort of pure value in the existence of a book. I do. As far as the question of because I understand what you're saying. You're asking about a kind of dichotomy between a book that is meant purely to entertain someone or on the opposite end to sort of make somebody think, right? And I don't know that I have a sort of like value judgment on whether one is better than the other. I enjoy both kinds. I do think that the kind that's meant to entertain is more bound up, I think, with business. I think there is more of a tendency with a book that's purely meant to entertain for that book to be sort of conceived of as a product and to entertain as many people as possible, right? Than with the other kind of book. Because a book that's challenging people is sort of inherently a book that's not meant to have mass appeal. Because if you're writing a book that's, making people critique their own practices in the world, like that's not a book that everybody's gonna love, right? And so I think maybe that dichotomy that exists, but I enjoy both kinds of books.
Anybody else?
Thanks so much, Deepa and Vauhini. This was a really wonderful conversation. Vauhini, I was wondering if I could ask you about ghosts. I was really moved by it, and I was wondering if there was anything that surprised you when writing with AI tools, and if your thoughts on it might have changed given recent conversations about its extractive potential, etc.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. It's interesting, in some of the recent conversations about AI, I've heard a lot of people say, yes, but AI is not capable of doing on the page what a human writer can do because it's not human, it doesn't have a body, right? It doesn't have a kind of social context. I was really surprised with that essay at certain lines that the AI wrote. There's one in particular that I talk about sometimes because it sort of embodies what I'm talking about here, which is that it makes up this scene. It says, my sister and I were driving home from the beach, and she took my hand, and it writes, this is the hand she took, the hand I am writing this with. And that reading that line moved me, because I thought, yeah, I mean, and it moved me on an emotional level and on an intellectual level. I realized I was like, yeah, the whole project of this essay is about trying to reconcile who I am now without my sister with the version that existed with my sister, who was a different version of me that almost died along with her, right? And for the AI to sort of have that quote unquote insight, like, was meaningful to me. And so it feels to me that one can say, like, yes, sometimes, on rare occasions, I don't know, often, whatever you want to say, an AI is capable of putting on the page something like that. But then the question becomes, like, what's the difference between, it doesn't matter that a software program wrote those words and not an actual human. And so I think that to me is like is going to in the future become a more relevant question than like, can it do the things we do? And for me, furthermore, the question of whether it was a computer or not matters less than the fact that these technologies so far tend to have been created by companies run by and funded by and owned by people who are already some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world. By the way the technologies work, and this is what you're referring to, I think, is by extracting all of this writing that exists already in the real world, including written by authors and non-authors. And so, like, I think sometimes, like, I think it's going to be increasingly useful to drill down on, like, what aspects of this make us uncomfortable. I think, like I said earlier, one can imagine a version of a technology like this that's trained, that's created using only writing that has been willingly, with consent, fed into it. Maybe by writers who have formed a collective that's interested in, like, sort of like a collective project of authorship, right? And so they all put their own writings in there together and play around with what it comes out with. I think, for me, there's something less problematic about that than something that's owned by a big technology company that's taking all this stuff without consent. The question of whether my thinking has changed since I wrote it is an interesting one. I think I was very aware of, I was very aware of some of the power dynamics when I wrote the essay. With respect to the extractive aspect, I have to say I wasn't thinking about it as much then as I am now. And I do wonder, like, how the essay would have been received if I first published it now, how I would be thinking about whether to publish it in the first place now versus before ChatGPT came out and this became a bigger part of the conversation, and it became clearer to us that these things, you know, could potentially replace a lot of jobs, that they are very extractive. So I think, yeah, it's a complicated question, and I have a complicated answer too.
Anybody else? Anyone else? Any other questions?
Thank you. Thank you both so much for a very intimate chat, actually. Vauhini, you mentioned the challenge sometimes of finding your character's voice and you wanting to sort of bash your head against a wall when you were talking about Athena. When you get these moments when you're trying to depict that character's voice and you just can't get on with it, what's your technique? So as a writer, and different to being a journalist, where as a journalist, you're interviewing, you've bashed out the profile. But when it's a fiction character and you can't find the voice, what's your method to come out of it and then come back?
I don't know that I have a good foolproof method. I'm thinking about two things when you say that, though. One of which is that sometimes we writers sort of like talk about our work as if it exists in isolation. And for me, writing in community has always been really important. And so my husband's a writer, a fiction writer as well. And so he read maybe 6 drafts of my book. Friends of mine read drafts of my book. And I really relied on these people whose judgment I trusted to tell me when it sounded right, when the voice sounded right, like it was alive and really working and really believable as the voice of this character, Athena, and when it wasn't, you know? And so that guidance played a really big role in my being able to kind of tune my ear to what was working and what wasn't. And then also, I have a friend, a writer friend, the writer Anna North, who sometimes writes in a sort of speculative mode. And she and other writers and other writer friends in earlier drafts of my book had said to me, like, with Athena in particular, when she's sort of telling her own story, that there were certain parts that like didn't quite feel alive on the page yet. And I said to her, I remember a phone call when I said to her, like, yeah, but I don't know how am I going to ever do that? And she said, well, you know, one thing you could do is just imagine what it's like to be her in these different contexts and then write that down. And that really is essentially, if you were to kind of boil down what we try to do, I say we because it sounds to me like you're a writer as well. What we try to do is boil that down. When we try to boil, if we were to boil down what a writer does, that's what it is. It's like daydreaming and doing what we did as children when we had imaginary friends and we're imagining ourselves as characters. You're pretending to be someone else, remembering what it was like to be in a similar circumstance and putting that down on paper. And when she broke it down that way, like, it made more sense to me.
Anybody else? Maybe time for one last question, I think. Maybe two. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, she can... After you, maybe you can pass the...
Thanks for a fantastic chat. It's actually to both of you. You were talking about the importance of authenticity, which I agree with completely. It feels like there's a lot of South Asian writers who come into prominence more recently now and maybe prioritized accessibility over, authenticity, right? Like it makes it more accessible to a wider readership, but as an Indian reading it, it feels just like, this is somebody who doesn't know, who's not experienced. But then again, more people are now becoming more aware, right? So I just wanted your thoughts, both of you, on, is it okay to sacrifice authenticity to make it more accessible to a wider audience?
I'd love to hear your thoughts, Deepa, on this.
I want to say, if you haven't read the Immortal King Rao, you can see that, it doesn't make any concessions to the reader. And, you have to really, to me, it felt very authentic. I was surprised to hear you say that you were worried about how it would be received in India, because I thought, to me, it felt very realistic. And I don't know if that means anything. But for me, the fictional world and the setting, everything seemed really true. And to answer that question of authenticity, I do get annoyed as a writer. You can feel that, this person has got everything wrong and the book is done well because it's without nuance. But I also think it's really up to the writer. It depends on your situation. I think it's very easy to be judgmental. And sometimes you want a book to sell, and maybe you're doing something to make that book sell, and that depends on your personal situation at that moment. Because I lived in India for such a long time, it would be really difficult for me to write something without nuance. Once you've experienced it, once you've seen it, I think like you have done, once you've gone and interviewed people, it becomes really difficult to make it simplistic, I think, to lose all that. But I'm trying to be less judgmental about other writers, is what I'm trying to say, I think. I don't know if that's an answer, but yeah. What do you think, Vauhini?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you, in your last novel, had to deal with a similar question, and sort of like writing about the lives of characters. You have spent a lot of your life in India, but you're writing about characters whose lives are different from yours. And I think also, like me, did a lot of research. And then at a certain point, some of it is faith, I think, sometimes, right? Like, it's like, okay, I've done the research. I think I know these characters. And now I'm just going to try. Let's see what happens,
Maybe time for one last question.
A wonderful conversation. Thank you both, and I'll be reading the book soon. Just a question that you have evolved, I'm sure, so much, and you've answered that in many questions. But with the timeline and the number of years it's gone for this book, did you come across many times a wall, writer's wall? And how did you deal with that? And following that is what is next now for you?
Thank you. I'll really briefly answer that to say that I came across a wall over and over. I took 13 years to write the book. And what I eventually did, it was psychological for me. I needed to sort of surpass a psychological barrier, the barrier being a belief that this book was going nowhere and was a waste of my time, right? And the only thing I did that it was ever useful to surmount that was to remember that there had also been times when, after a writing session, I told myself, like, this book is brilliant, maybe the best book ever written in history, and the world is going to be so lucky for it to exist. Not because I thought that was accurate either, but to remind myself that both ways of viewing the book were inaccurate, and so I should just shut up, and if I wanted to write the book, and maybe it would happen and maybe it wouldn't. Yeah. Oh, and what's next is a collection of short stories, which comes out this fall. It's called This Is Salvaged.
Great. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Vauhini.
Thank you, Deepa. That was such a great conversation.